So let me play with a bit of an impossible idea. Can we remember everything we read? It's kind of a highly searched term, and whilst it does sound like a largely fantastical reality, and it is to the vast majority of us, the desire to learn how to remember everything we read will take us closer to the relationship we want with the subjects that matter to us and the knowledge we wish to collate. Podcast listeners will know that this moment kind of came to me a few months ago when I sat down to read a book which piqued my interest, only to discover upon opening it that not only had I read it, I'd annotated it. And then when I picked up a second book, the same thing happened again. And, I spiraled and panicked and I thought, oh my goodness, my brain is going to pop. But to be fair, I should have given myself some grace, as both of these books were read at the very beginning of the first pandemic lockdown in the UK, which probably constituted to my complete mental blind spot recording these books, because let's face it, other things were happening at the time for all of us. However, it did get me thinking, how can I prevent this from happening to me again? Or rather, how can I hone in, amplify skills which I know I actually technically have? You see, weirdly enough, I sort of have this uncanny ability to remember exactly where I've left off in a book. Take the books, the Book of Jacob by Olga Tokarczuk and also The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. The first one I stopped reading in May 2022, and the second one I stopped reading as part of a second read-through in September 2011. And I can remember exactly where I left these characters. Somehow it's always been the case for me that I can leave a text and then pick it up weeks, months, or years later, and it doesn't feel any different from me reading it a few hours later. These examples got me thinking, what is the difference in my brain between the books I left unfinished and the books I left finished and annotated? Why are the unfinished books actively still playing a role in my mind, whilst the unfinished books escaped me entirely? And what skill am I applying to the former that I can potentially apply to the latter, or actively engage with to get more out of my reading experience? Well, obviously, the first thing we actually technically need to address is why we forget books that we read. Well, naturally, memories fade over time, and if they're not playing a part of our active recall, certain elements in life, from the videos that you watched on YouTube to the books that you read or facts you learned in school, will weaken in time and potentially be completely forgotten, depending on how you apply the knowledge. We'll come to that later. Now, obviously, this goes the same for books. The books that we read 5 years ago will often be less vivid in our memories than books we read in the past 6 months or the past week. However, memories are reinforced the more you recall them. So if you talk about a particular book a lot, or you did a research paper on it, or you recommend it to a lot of people, or you even apply the principles it taught you on a regular basis, the book will stay alive in your mind in much more vivid memory than maybe a book that didn't really impact you or that you don't really like. Now, this is also probably why I remember where I left off at The Grapes of Wrath and the Book of Jacob, because all these years later, I still tell the story of how I can remember vividly where I left off these characters, and by relaying that story either to myself or others, it keeps those elements alive and at the forefront of my memory, so they're not that hard in the past to dig back in on. We don't really give our brains much credit for what they have stored off-site, as it were, i.e. sort of in the memory vaults, lurking deep down in the shadows, only to pop out during the middle of a pub quiz or when you're watching an episode of University Challenge. For example, my Latin comprehension sits so far back in my brain that I normally write off my ability to read any Latin. I tell people I can't read it anymore, until one day I sat down and decided to do beginner's Latin in Duolingo and found it incredibly easy, and I knew all the vocabulary already. As such, not all is lost when we have a horrifying realization that we've already read the book that we sat down to read. I mean, the fact that I remembered I'd already read Disgrace and Catcher in the Rye a few chapters into reading them was not only a saving grace, let's put it that way, but evidence of the skill being alive and well. However, how can we improve our chances of remembering most of what we read? How can we strengthen our recall processes and retain the value of what we read in everyday life? Well, the first thing I want to talk about, which is sort of pretty obvious in my opinion, but never gets mentioned when I look into how other people discuss this topic, is mental health and stress. It's fine and dandy to pick up techniques and skills of how to remember things, but unless you take care of your stress and your mental health, that's like downloading fancy software from a computer that's riddled with viruses. Unless you manage and deal with what's going on in your operating software, you're not going to improve your performance no matter how many fancy things you download. So let's talk about stress Stress, as you probably know, is a survival response, regardless of if you're in imminent danger or you're just stressed by something at work or your finances. When your brain perceives that you are in a dangerous situation or an emotionally taxing one, the amygdala, the part of your brain that controls survival instincts, takes over. When this happens, other parts of your brain which deal with much higher functions, such as parts which store your memories or perform difficult tasks, are given much less energy in order to prioritise your survival. Thank God for that. Obviously, we need it when it actually happens, but when we're stressed, we're not really in a survival mode. Our brain can't distinguish between those two factors. So obviously, when we are in survival mode, we're not going to perform high-level cognitive functions at any meaningful level. And as such, the more stressed you are, the less likely you'll be able to remember things for an exam or the books you've read. Now, stress is obviously a possible reason why I forgot the 2 books I read at the beginning of 2020, at the beginning of the UK lockdown more specifically, because let's face it, a rapidly spreading virus with no known vaccine was a lot for most of us to deal with. Now, we all know not all stress is bad. However, as a study from 2016 explains, quote, while stress around the time of learning is thought to enhance memory formation, thus leading to robust memories, stress markedly impairs memory retrieval, bearing, for instance, the risk of underachieving at exams. Now, one of the reasons that I'm really passionate about emphasising this and the impact of stress on the brain, and particularly in academic context, is because I left my PhD for a while due to the damage stress has done to my brain, and it was manifesting in many other physical symptoms, but primarily my brain was where I was falling apart. You see, chronic stress may actually rewire our brains, resulting in long-term activity maintaining itself within primitive areas of the brain, such as the amygdala, at the expense of the prefrontal cortex, which again is responsible for organising and motivating execution of higher performing tasks. Like any muscle that you're training, constant activity in the amygdala strengthens this area and results in the weakening of areas such as the prefrontal cortex. So if we don't manage our stress and keep on top of that first and foremost, no amount of techniques or reading methods will improve our retention. So let's talk about how we can actually deal with stress. Now, naturally, there are things that you've heard of over and over and over again. Meditation, journaling, breathing exercises, and physical activity. Even as little as 8 minutes of high-intensity physical activity is enough to reduce stress levels and help on our slow but positive journey towards rewiring our brains. However, another huge contributor to managing our stress is our diet. We are what we eat, and improving our diet and limiting things like UPFs and artificial sweeteners also causes major changes in how our brain functions. So 2 books that I've read in the past 6 to 9 months about the importance food plays in our cognition were How to Build a Healthy Brain, Reduce Stress, Anxiety and Depression, and Future-Proof Your Brain by Kimberly Wilson, genuinely life-changing, and also Ultra-Processed People by Chris Van Tulloken, which I read more recently. And there are some flaws in his choosing of data. I'm just being quite honest. However, he did introduce me to a lot of ideas, which I went and researched independently. So keep that in mind. However, Wilson's book, I cannot fault personally. And one particular rabbit hole I went down after reading that book was researching into reducing my anxiety and my stress, which I really suffer with anxiety. And one of the ingredients I've been particularly interested in is ashwagandha, which isn't exactly something you come across in your diet every day. You normally have to take it through different forms like supplements. And one of the most effective ways I've actually found to incorporate ashwagandha in my diet is through today's sponsor, which is Magic Mind. And I've used Magic Mind for over 6 months in past my daily routine. So I'm really excited to be working with Magic Mind today for this video. Magic Mind is a mental performance shot, which is crafted with 12 active ingredients, including adaptogens such as ashwagandha, which is what I found it for, and cordyceps mushrooms, designed to promote calm energy and promote focus and reduce stress. Formula includes science-backed ingredients like cognizin, citicoline, bacopa monnieri, and lion's mane mushroom, which support brain function, enhance focus, and boosts mental clarity through improved nutrient delivery. Now, if you're a fan of matcha green tea, like me, you'll love this. It's primarily matcha green tea focused, that's the first ingredient in it, but it tastes like matcha green tea mixed with passion fruit. A small shot does pack a powerful punch, as it also fulfills 100% of our daily vitamin C or vitamin D needs. Since I started Magic Mind, I have noticed a significant improvement in my ability to concentrate with my reading sessions and leading to better retention of information. So So if you are also interested in trying Magic Mind for yourself, you can use my code and my link in the description box down below. I'll link it all down there, and it's all on the screen as well. Thank you so much, Magic Mind, for sponsoring today's video. And now let's get back into reading retention. Now, obviously the next thing about helping us with our reading retention is taking things slower. If you want to remember everything you read, this hypothetical concept, but as much as possible, you need to take your time when you're reading. Now, whilst I've often found myself victim to criticism for how slowly I read, because I'm dyslexic, so one of the payoffs is that the texts I read stick with me much longer than many of my classmates or colleagues in academia. You see, the things that we take time and actively consider consuming remain with us much longer than the content we binge. Using a study conducted from the University of Melbourne, we can see the effects that binge watching, for example, has on long-term memory. The researchers found that whilst those who binged watch content scored the highest recall scores immediately after watching a show, they scored lower than those who watched weekly and when they were tested again on the show 140 days later. Additionally, they found that the binge watchers actually enjoyed the show less than those who consumed it over a longer period of time. Now, this is similar as to why you may likely remember a book that you read last year in more detail than the 5 articles that you read this morning online or in the past week. Fast consumption is not conducive to long-term memory retention. So the faster you listen to or read a book, the less chance you have in remembering it years later. But here's a real thought that we need to concentrate on as well as we go through this video. While the idea of remembering everything you read may seem appealing, it also seems incredibly exhausting and not really worth it. Just like news articles that we read online, not everything we read is valuable for our long-term memory. And as such, we shouldn't really extend our limited cognitive abilities on trying to remember everything, when we can prioritise remembering only that which is valuable, which may only be a single idea from a whole book. What you find valuable is entirely subjective, and whilst you may feel frustrated that you didn't remember all the names of the catalogue of ships in the Iliad, we can rationalise that your only desire for that was likely some incredibly niche party trick that would impress very, very few people, rather than remember it for being part of a significant body of text which you want to share with others in the hopes of inspiring them and changing their lives. But if you're going to argue with me that the catalogue of ships is a personally inspiring, exhilarating and life-changing section of text for you, and you want to share it to the world, then good for you, good for you. But if you're not that type of person and you want to actively work in engaging with the text more, writing in the margins and on sticky notes has always been the most efficient way I have found in honing the value of a text when I revisit it. Just make sure when you're ever using sticky notes that you use like washi tape or some kind of tape to prevent it from falling out of the books. Learned that from personal experience. So for example, going back to the books that I forgot that I read 5 years ago, once I got over my panic and I sat down with the text and looked at them, I could see from my annotations parts that came right back, flooding back to me when I read it again. I'll show you a preview of my copy of After Sappho, which I have, and as the front you will see that I have a key of the categories that I determined within the text that I found relevant for me. There were more categories existing within the text, I narrowed it down to these. These match my margin notes, so I can easily identify the theme of the note by a glance, by jogging my memory and then reading that section entirely if I need to. Now, whilst the garish pink pen may not be aesthetically pleasing in the world of dark academia, I find writing in a contrasting colour in text makes the body of text easier to read later for a reread, and it also helps me distinguish dates of my notes. So were I to add new notes at a later date, I would do so in a different colour, like green or blue or purple, to contrast my first round of notes. But also, again, keeping the body of text the most prominent colour, black, so I can read it without getting distracted. Now, what I write in the margins is everything from disagreements to thoughts that I had, questions of a sentence or a paragraph that were raised within me as I read it, or things that I would like to research at a later date, or connections that I can see between this text and another text. Now, this isn't a quick process. This edition of After Sappho took me over a month to read with this as my reading technique, and I also took notes as I went along on my computer and in a notebook. The more you extrapolate on a text and engage with it actively, the more that you'll be able to recall later, especially if you do it by hand, as you're building more connections physically with the process of the text, which serve as additional avenues of recall. Now, some people use note cards, which can organise and categorise in boxes. So you write a thought on a note card, and then you have a box with particular themes, and you slot your note card in. Now, that's fine if you don't mind splitting up a text into fragments that go over different categories. However, because I specialise in literature and academia, I often normally need to stick to a close text analysis. So I have to keep my text together. I can't split it across themes. I split it into themes within the text, but I can't split my text across different themes because then it will get complicated and messy, particularly if I'm doing closed text analysis. So I will always write in the margins, keep a notebook, and take photographs of the books that I am taking notes of. So take photographs of the margins, type up your things into a note app like Bear or another document, back that up for goodness sake, and also then use hashtags to bring in different sections together. So I'd rather employ hashtags to be able to unite different texts together than write them on little individual note cards, put them in different categories, and then have my text effectively diluted across a box. So really, that's how I build together my body of knowledge from books that I remember. I remember a lot of the books that I read. Some I don't need to really remember, but even the ones I don't really need to remember, if I start accidentally reading it, I always find out quite quickly that I've already read this text before and I remember exactly what's about to happen. So ways you can get around this is to read in scheduled sessions with breaks. There is no use working for hours and hours and hours on end, or reading for hours and hours on end, or reading really quickly. Take it at a nice pace, like have an hour on, 15-minute break, an hour on, 15-minute break, and so on. Try and take notes in the margins. That will help jog your memory much faster, and you can elaborate on your own notes later if you don't understand them. Make them as clear as possible and extrapolate on them using sticky tab notes, or even the blank part of the end of a chapter to write some notes down. Also, another way of recalling information easier is to summarise what you have read. This is ideally in non-fiction, or if you're reading an academic article, writing a summary. And you can do this either verbally as well. You can take a note of it, a voice note, if you find that easier, or written down. Well, I hope you found this helpful. If you did, please let me know down below. Send in any requests that you would like. Consider giving this video a like or subscribing if you are new. Thank you as always to my patrons for making this possible. I really, really, truly appreciate you. I have a podcast, a second channel, all linked down below, and a Google form. So if you have any requests for particular things you'd like me to talk about in a video, please leave it down below. But as always, I hope you are happy and healthy. And remember, books save lives. So keep reading.